August 12, 1570, Kremlin Palace, Moscow. The air was thick with incense and dread inside the Kremlin Palace. Chandeliers of wrought iron flickered with dim candlelight as the echo of armored boots filled the grand hall. That morning, on the 12th of August, 1570, Tsar Ivan IV, whom many already whispered of as Ivan the Terrible, sat upon his carved throne, dressed in black velvet embroidered with blood-red thread. He looked more like a funeral ghost than a ruler, but it suited the mood. Before him, chained and trembling, stood Prince Mikhail Turov, a nobleman accused of conspiring against the Tsar. In truth, no one truly knew if Mikhail had plotted anything at all. But Ivan didn't need proof. He needed theater, fear, and most of all submission. The chamber wasn't empty. Ivan had summoned his court, noblemen, advisors, and their wives. Even young pages stood at the edges, eyes wide, too scared to look away. The Tsar had made one thing clear: everyone would witness what loyalty meant. Or more precisely, what the lack of it would cost. Mikhail's garments were ripped away with forceful precision. His pale skin stood exposed in the cold Moscow air, his noble blood offering no protection from the humiliation. Gasps escaped from the women. Some turned away, but none dared leave. Ivan leaned forward, smiling thinly. "Let Moscow see," he murmured, "what happens to those who mistake my mercy for weakness." Executioners approached, tools in hand. They were not cloaked men, but members of the oprichniki, Ivan's black-clad secret police. Men who lived for cruelty, fed by paranoia. Mikhail, once a proud man, wept like a child before the steel even touched his skin. But Ivan wanted the tears. The fear, the begging. That was part of the punishment, part of the message. The act itself was brutal, surgical, and horrifyingly slow. Mikhail's screams echoed across the marble halls, bouncing like trapped ghosts in the vaulted ceilings. Yet Ivan watched with an unsettling calm. Occasionally he made crude jokes, asking Mikhail if he still felt like a man, or whether betrayal was worth his little pride. When it was done, what remained of the prince was paraded through the streets, blood trailing behind him like a thread of ruined dignity. Naked, broken, and in agony, he was displayed as an example, a message soaked in blood and shame. Hours later, he was finally granted death, but the message had already landed. This was not a rare spectacle. It was just the latest. Ivan had, over time, turned bodily violation into his favorite form of punishment. He didn't want silence from his enemies. He wanted cries, and most of all, he wanted shame. To rob them not just of life, but of dignity, lineage, and manhood. Historians later debated whether Ivan's madness began with the death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560, or whether it had always been inside him, waiting. After she died, something dark took root in the Tsar's heart. He created the oprichnina, a twisted state within a state where the oprichniki reigned with swords and black horses, wielding cruelty as law. Their brutality was not merely violent, it was perverse. Women whose husbands were executed were not just widowed. They were brought to court, stripped before the nobles, and either sent to convents or distributed like war spoils among the oprichniki. The goal was to kill more than a man. It was to murder the soul of a family. In the same year as Mikhail's death, Ivan descended upon Novgorod, a city he accused of harboring traitors. What followed was not just a massacre, it was an orgy of violence and humiliation. Ivan, perched on a wooden platform like a conductor of cruelty, ordered that noble women be stripped and violated in the streets, mothers, daughters, wives. The entire city watched itself be gutted, not only by sword, but by shame. He understood something terrifying, that sex, or rather its corruption, could dominate where swords failed. A man killed might be remembered. A man humiliated was erased. Yet Ivan was not alone in such perversions of power. Across time and continents, kings had realized the terrifying utility of sexual punishment. Rulers who wanted more than death, they wanted complete psychological ruin. And it was only the beginning. Centuries before Ivan IV cast his shadow over Russia, another ruler turned the sacred into the grotesque. In the heart of Cairo, where minarets kissed the sky and the Nile shimmered like silver under the sun, the city once trembled under the reign of a man both feared and worshipped, Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, the sixth Fatimid Caliph. His rule began in 996 AD, and his madness unfolded like slow poison. At first the people admired him. He was young, intelligent, devout. But that image soon decayed. Something shifted in his mind, perhaps broken by isolation, divine delusion, or sheer cruelty. By the time Cairo fully realized who he had become, it was too late. Al-Hakim's laws came like thunderbolts, sudden and without mercy. His guards announced new decrees weekly, sometimes daily. One of his most infamous commands fell not upon soldiers or rebels, but upon women. He declared that no woman in Egypt was to leave her home. No exceptions. He didn't merely demand obedience, he dismantled the very means of movement. Cobblers were forbidden from making women's shoes. Merchants caught selling them were punished as if they had sold weapons to the enemy. But it wasn't just control he craved. It was public submission, shame, spectacle. Women caught outdoors were not simply fined or jailed. They were stripped, sometimes entirely, and whipped in public squares. In the heart of Cairo, under the gaze of men, elders, and even their own children, they were turned from citizens into examples. The lashes were not for the body alone. They were for the soul. Arab chroniclers like Ibn al-Kalani recorded the events in horror. He wrote of a mother just trying to reach her sick child across the city. She was dragged into the marketplace, her veil torn off, and whipped as men laughed, spat, and cheered. She died 3 days later from the wounds. Not just those on her back, but those in her spirit. Al-Hakim also took aim at the very desires of his people. He banned foods he believed to be aphrodisiacs, dates, certain spices, rare wines. Sellers were castrated publicly if caught, their punishment displayed like street theater. The law said they had corrupted society's virtue. Al-Hakim said removing their manhood was a divine cleansing. One man, just a humble spice merchant, was caught with a cart of dried figs and saffron. He begged, cried, swore he hadn't known. But none of it mattered. Before a crowd of hundreds, his trousers were cut, his legs bound, and his groin crushed by the executioner's blade. Al-Hakim watched from his balcony, sipping something dark, emotionless. But his most twisted punishment came in the form of what he called moral realignment. If a man was accused, not proven, just accused, of gazing at a woman inappropriately, he could be sentenced not only to castration, but to gender inversion. One such man, a baker's apprentice, was dragged from his stall after a noblewoman claimed he looked at her too long. He was punished publicly, castrated by torchlight, then forced into a dress and veil. For the rest of his life he was made to sell bread in women's clothing. His voice muffled, his eyes lowered, mocked daily as the eunuch bride of the market. Even political enemies were not spared from such violations. When conspiracies rose from his own viziers, men who had once sat beside him, guided him, Al-Hakim responded not with swift executions, but with humiliation. He ordered them paraded backward on donkeys, naked from the waist up, their robes stained with ink and filth. The backwards position on the donkey was symbolic, meant to say they had turned away from truth and now faced shame. But that was only the beginning. Once the parade was done, their manhood was cut away, followed by beheadings. It was not death that frightened his enemies. It was the degradation before it. What made Al-Hakim so terrifying wasn't just the punishments. It was the pleasure he took in orchestrating them. He didn't want rebellion crushed. He wanted it unborn. And then, as mysteriously as he appeared, he vanished. One night in 1021, under a full moon, Al-Hakim walked into the hills outside Cairo for one of his nocturnal walks, and never returned. Some say his sister arranged his death. Others say his own guards turned on him. There are even whispers of divine punishment, but the damage he inflicted did not vanish with him. Cairo remembered. The Nile remembered. Every broken body, every shamed soul, every woman whipped for walking, all of them became part of Egypt's darker memories. because cruelty that invades the body leaves wounds. But cruelty that invades dignity leaves scars that bleed across generations. The stone walls of the Château de Plessis-les-Tours held secrets that no priest would bless and no poet would dare write. Behind its damp corridors and cold iron gates ruled Louis XV, the King of France from 1461 to 1483, known to history as the Universal Spider, a man who wove webs of political betrayal, espionage, and cruelty so tight even his closest allies feared they'd one day hang from it. Unlike Ivan or Al-Hakim, Louis rarely screamed or raged. He smiled, he whispered, and then he destroyed you slowly. At first glance, his punishments didn't seem sexual. They were not soaked in blood or ritual humiliation like those of the East, but they were no less intimate. Louis believed that a man's honor lived not just in his name, but in his family, his bloodline, and most of all, in the purity of his daughters. So he didn't just kill his enemies, he poisoned their legacy. When a noble betrayed him, Louis didn't always send him to the gallows. Sometimes he sent his daughter to a pig farmer. It started with the Duke of Alençon, who was accused of conspiring with English agents. Rather than execute him outright, Louis captured the Duke's only daughter, a 16-year-old girl educated in Latin and courtly manners. Instead of imprisonment, she was forced to marry a man from the lowest caste, a toothless, middle-aged butcher. The wedding was performed in the royal chapel, not in celebration, but in mockery. Louis himself attended. He even insisted that the marriage be consummated under observation to confirm its legitimacy. The girl, once promised to a foreign prince, was now reduced to a broodmare for a man who didn't know how to read. And the Duke? He watched it all from a tiny iron cage suspended in the palace garden, naked except for his undergarments. For weeks, that was Louis's way. Not blood, not screams, but humiliation as slow poison. Philippe de Comines, Louis's trusted chronicler, wrote about these cages with a kind of hushed awe. They were barely large enough for a man to crouch, too small to stand or stretch. Some cages hung above public roads, where the people could pass by, spit, mock, and throw filth. A noble accused of mocking Louis's lineage spent 3 years in such a cage, naked the entire first winter. Birds pecked his skin. Children laughed and pointed, but Louis went further. When he captured Cardinal Jean Balou, a powerful church figure who dared defy him, he didn't just imprison him. He stripped him of his robes and chained him in a specially designed iron enclosure that allowed only one position, bent at the knees, hunched at the back, neck tilted sideways. He lived like that for 11 years. Once a year, Louis would order him stripped and exhibited in front of visiting ambassadors to remind the world, he said, that pride makes fools of all men, even God's servants. But Louis's most grotesque punishment came in 1478, when he crushed a rebellion of Gascon lords. Instead of mass executions, he seized their widows and daughters and issued a royal decree. They were to be redistributed as wives to men of his choosing, not knights or merchants, but debtors, drunks, and criminals recently released from the Bastille. Each forced marriage was conducted under royal seal. In one infamous case, a noblewoman whose husband had died resisting Louis's troops was forced to marry the court executioner. He had once beheaded her cousin. She was made to kneel and kiss his boots before their wedding night, under the gaze of the court. Louis later joked that she was now married to justice. There was no trial, no war, no formal rebellion that sparked this. Only whispers. That was enough. Louis turned family into a battlefield. He knew that shame was eternal. A man hanged dies once, but a man whose lineage is corrupted, whose daughter is made to birth beggars, suffers beyond the grave. And the cruelty worked. Few dared plot against him again. His enemies died with their bloodlines dishonored, erased from noble history not by sword, but by enforced humiliation. Louis died in 1483, his body weak, but his legend strong. The French people remembered his reign not for battles won or laws passed, but for how deeply he had corrupted the meaning of punishment. Not through gore, through degradation. The sun over Jerusalem could be beautiful, even merciful, but under King Herod's rule, it often shined down on screams. The city, ancient and holy, bore witness to many tyrants, but none matched Herod in his blend of paranoia, brutality, and intimate cruelty. Herod the Great ruled Judea from 37 to 4 BC as a client king of Rome. His palaces were grand, his building projects legendary. He even expanded the Second Temple. But for all his monuments, Herod left behind a darker legacy, one etched not in stone, but in the broken dignity of those he ruled. At the center of Herod's madness was his obsession with control, not just of power, but of private life, intimate life. His rule was soaked in suspicion. No one was safe. Not lovers, not wives, not even his own sons. It began with Mariamne, his wife, his beloved. Her beauty was unmatched, her lineage royal, and her presence in the beginning softened Herod's cruelty. But over time, jealousy rotted his love into something monstrous. Rumors began, planted perhaps by enemies, or maybe born in Herod's own poisoned mind, that Mariamne was unfaithful, that she had eyes for another man. Herod didn't confront her at first. He tortured her servants instead. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, documented what followed in chilling detail. The maids were stripped and beaten, sometimes in front of the court, sometimes in private chambers, their bodies turned into confession devices. Under agony, one of them finally broke, and Herod believed every word, but Mariamne. She denied everything. Herod didn't believe her. He ordered that she be brought before the royal court, not for justice, but for humiliation. In front of senators, guards, and nobles, the accusations were read aloud. Intimate, graphic, cruel. Details twisted to shock, to shame, to destroy what dignity she still had. Her face didn't break, but her heart did. He had her executed soon after, but death wasn't enough. Herod reportedly mourned her with wild, obsessive grief, visiting her tomb frequently, touching her burial shroud, muttering to her body. Some chroniclers whispered that he ordered her corpse preserved, visited in secret, for reasons too disturbing to write. Whether true or not, the stories spread because people believed he was capable of it. And then came the retaliation. Any noble who had ever shown sympathy toward Mariamne was marked. Her cousins, her brothers, even distant relatives. Executed, yes, but not quickly. Their wives were forced into public disgrace. Some were stripped before the court, accused of being seducers of loyalty. Others were handed over to soldiers with no protection. It was Herod's way of killing not just the body, but the memory. To shame a bloodline so thoroughly that future generations would dare not speak it aloud. And he wasn't done. When nobles plotted against him, and many did, terrified of his instability, Herod didn't respond with clean executions. He turned punishment into performance. In one case, a wealthy merchant accused of financing a rebellion was not immediately executed. Herod ordered that his daughters, aged 14 and 16, be seized. They were paraded through the streets, their robes torn, their heads shaved, symbols of violated purity. The crowd was forced to watch. The message was clear: your rebellion will cost more than your life. It will cost your daughters' names, and it reached beyond the palace walls. Josephus wrote of an incident in the Jerusalem theater, a place Herod had built to impress Roman visitors. But one day it became a place of horror. A group of political prisoners, including several women, were dragged onto the stage, accused of conspiracy. Before their execution, their families were forced to sit in the front rows. The women were stripped, mocked, and subjected to vile acts, while Herod's soldiers played roles like actors in a grotesque play. He wanted an audience, because Herod understood something most tyrants only suspected. If you kill a man, you risk martyrdom. But if you shame him, expose him, defile his wife, his daughter, his memory, then you kill him forever. When he suspected 2 of his sons were plotting to claim the throne, he didn't wait for confirmation. He had them arrested and interrogated. and though they confessed nothing, he ordered them strangled in secret. Before doing so, he had their servants whipped and shamed in public, to crush any remaining loyalty they might have commanded. Near his death, Herod's paranoia became so consuming that he supposedly left orders that prominent Jewish elders be executed when he died, to ensure the country mourned, even if not for him. The plan failed, but it speaks volumes. This was a man who ruled by fear, and more than that, by shame. In Herod's Judea, to defy the king meant your name, your blood, your body, and your family's honor would be dragged through filth before being buried. And so he died, unloved, untrusted, and unmourned, his legacy sealed not in the stones of his temples, but in the violated hearts of a kingdom too afraid to speak his name without spitting. The forests of Wallachia whispered at night. They were thick, black, and alive with the screams of men who had once defied Vlad III, the Impaler, the prince who ruled not with justice, but with terror sharpened to a point. Known later as Dracula, Vlad ruled Wallachia in the 15th century, most famously between 1456 and 1462. His reputation was soaked in blood, but his cruelty was never just about death. It was about how that death was delivered. Where Ivan mocked, Louis schemed, and Herod shamed, Vlad combined all three and added something worse: spectacle. He turned punishment into theater. In Wallachia, treason wasn't simply punished with the sword. It was impaled, slowly, publicly, and often through the most private parts of a man or woman's body. It wasn't an accident. It was a message, carved into flesh and left to rot in the open. The Saxon chronicles from Transylvania describe in gruesome detail how Vlad reserved his most horrific impalements for those accused of sexual sins. But they were often only sins because he declared them as such: adultery, prostitution, suspicion of disloyalty through marriage. These weren't moral crimes, they were political threats. And Vlad had a method for making sure no one forgot who ruled. In one infamous account from a German manuscript dated 1488, a noblewoman said to be the mistress of a rival boyar was captured by Vlad's guards. She was not tried. She was not questioned. She was simply dragged to the front gates of Vlad's castle, stripped, tied to a stake, and impaled, not through the chest or the back, but through her intimate parts. Witnesses said she screamed for nearly an hour as the stake slowly forced its way upward, exiting through her mouth by sunset. Her body was left there for days, naked, disfigured, decaying, visible to all travelers as a warning. Don't just betray me with words, don't dare betray me with your body either. But women weren't the only ones to suffer. A young man, a servant accused of bedding a nobleman's wife, was punished in a way that blurred the line between horror and madness. Vlad ordered the boy bound, castrated in front of the entire court, then had his severed genitals forced into his mouth. He was gagged with his own sin, so to speak, then impaled. The woman, his lover, was spared only so she could watch. Vlad believed seeing her beloved suffer would be a punishment more permanent than death. He was probably right. Vlad's reign became defined not by laws or victories, but by the image of forests of impaled bodies. Hundreds, even thousands, lined up like twisted art. Some victims were tied upright on stakes, others left to slide down them by the pull of gravity. Birds pecked at their eyes. Wolves gnawed their feet at night, but there were details most historians avoided discussing: how those stakes were used, where they were inserted, and who they targeted, because Vlad's cruelty had a focus: humiliation that lived in the sexual realm. Women caught without veils, men who smiled at the wrong noblewoman, foreign emissaries who refused to remove their turbans. Vlad nailed the turbans to their skulls. He didn't need proof of disobedience. Suspicion was enough. The mere idea of desire outside his control was treason. Even inside his court, fear reigned. Nobles who questioned his authority risked more than execution. If their families had women, wives, daughters, sisters, those women became currency for his wrath. One widow of a rebel noble was forced to dress in a harlot's robe and sweep the palace steps for weeks, while guards spat at her. Another noble's daughter, only 15, was forced to marry a peasant stable boy, then raped publicly in the town square as a gift from the prince, and Vlad, he often watched. Chroniclers reported that he would dine near the execution sites, chewing roasted meat while the impaled writhed and moaned. They say he once dipped his bread in the blood of a victim, laughing as his soldiers vomited nearby, because for Vlad, pain wasn't enough. Death wasn't enough. He wanted the memory of disobedience to rot with the body, to humiliate the soul long after the person was gone. He believed that fear kept peace, and shame kept silence, and for a time he was right. Wallachhia's crime rate plummeted. No one stole, no one rebelled, not because they loved him, but because they feared what he might do to them, or worse, to their daughters. He died in 1476. His body was buried, exhumed, moved, and lost to history. But his legend never faded, because he had found the ultimate weapon of tyranny, not iron, not fire, but sex, twisted into shame. Intimacy turned into public terror. The streets of Delhi had seen conquest, glory, and the rise and fall of empires. But during the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled from 1325 to 1351, the city was gripped not just by tyranny, but by a ruler whose brilliance was matched only by his madness. Tughlaq was a scholar, a poet, a philosopher, and also a man drowning in paranoia. His reign was filled with grand visions, moving the capital, creating new coins, uniting faiths. But beneath these ambitions, something else festered, a deep fear of betrayal and a hunger to break not only bodies, but reputations, and it was the intimate domain, the realm of honor, shame, and sexual dignity, where he struck the deepest. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler who served in his court, recorded the strangest things. He saw Delhi transform from a place of prayer and trade into a circus of public punishments, many laced with humiliation far beyond death, rebellion, adultery, even the suspicion of improper relationships. These were treated not with quiet trials or secret executions. No. Tughlaq wanted people to watch. He wanted them to remember. One of his favorite punishments, Battuta wrote, was dressing the condemned in donkey skin, tight, itchy, and degrading. The skin would shrink in the sun, tightening around the chest and groin. The victim, often a noble or an official, would be paraded through Delhi's crowded markets on an actual donkey, mounted backwards, facing the people. It was a position meant to mock. In South Asian culture, it was the ultimate shame to ride backwards like a fool, to be looked at while utterly powerless. But even that was not enough. In one well-documented case, a governor from Bengal was accused of plotting rebellion. He was brought to Delhi in chains. Before execution, Tughlaq ordered that he be stripped and his clothes burned publicly to symbolize the burning of his authority. He was made to walk, naked and bleeding, from the city gates to the royal courtyard, surrounded by guards who mocked his manhood with obscene chants. Then, in front of a packed square, he was castrated. Only afterward was he executed, his body dragged through the city tied to the tail of an ox, turning a political death into a festival of disgrace. But it wasn't just rebels. Even suspected affairs within the palace earned punishment soaked in cruelty. Battuta himself witnessed one such moment. A courtier, rumored to have exchanged glances with a woman from the royal harem, was seized during a feast. Before the shocked audience of nobles and entertainers, he was ordered to strip, then lashed across his genitals with a whip soaked in salt water. Blood flowed. He screamed. The audience watched in terror, knowing that looking away could mean death. Afterward, the woman was brought out, still in royal garb, and made to watch as her lover was beheaded. Her fate was worse. She was stoned to death the next day, but first made to wash the blood of her dead lover off her hands in front of the crowd. These weren't isolated acts. They were patterns. Tughlaq treated honor like a weapon and violation as a tool of obedience. He would often arrest men accused of immorality, not proven. No trial, no evidence, just rumors. Some were made to wear women's clothing and serve drinks in the royal court, dressed in silks with painted faces, their beards shaved, their voices mocked. It was a living punishment, one that lasted years for some, until they broke or died of shame. One infamous case involved a respected teacher, falsely accused of enticing one of the palace boys. Instead of execution, Tughlaq ordered him to live out the rest of his days dressed as a dancer, performing in the streets during festivals, his chains disguised as jewelry, his eyes painted black. No one dared defend him. No one dared even speak his name again. And yet through all this cruelty, Tughlaq spoke of morality, discipline, divine order. He saw himself as a reformer, cleansing society through fear, through righteous punishment. But it was never about God. It was about control. By the end of his rule, Delhi had become a haunted city. Markets quieted at dusk. Laughter was rare. Families whispered at home, afraid to even glance in ways that might suggest seduction or desire, because under Tughlaq, even your body, even the way you walked, the way your daughter smiled, could be used against you. He died in 1351, likely poisoned by someone close. No public mourning, no grand tombs, only silence. But that silence wasn't peace, it was fear, still echoing in the soil of Delhi, a fear born from the day power reached into people's most private lives and tore their dignity. Out for all to see, the throne of England during the 16th century wasn't merely a seat of power. It was a stage of intimate control, where King Henry VIII ruled not just with laws and armies, but with marriages, beds, and public shaming disguised as justice. He wore the crown from 1509 to 1547, but it was in his private chambers, his marriages, annulments, and trials, where Henry's true tyranny came to life. Beneath the silken ceremony was a man who used sex and shame to dismantle reputations, punish disobedience, and dominate the most sacred aspects of personal life. At first, the kingdom adored him, a young athletic king with charm and grandeur. But as his obsession with a male heir grew, so did his cruelty. One by one, the women who once shared his bed became enemies. Their bodies politicized, their private lives paraded through courts like exhibits in a circus. It began with Anne Boleyn, his second wife, after he broke from the Pope and the Catholic Church to marry her. But when she failed to produce a son, Henry turned on her with venom. He didn't just want her gone, he wanted her ruined. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. But it wasn't enough to kill her quietly. No, Henry made sure her trial was public, an event where the most intimate and shameful allegations were read aloud before the court. Details of her supposed affairs, how she looked at men, what she wore in private, whispers of seduction, were laid out not for truth, but for humiliation. Some of her accused lovers were tortured, some confessed under duress. Whether any of it was real didn't matter. What mattered was the spectacle, a queen accused of filth, paraded like a common harlot before her execution. When she was finally beheaded, it was done with a foreign executioner brought in from France, famous for his clean sword. Henry claimed it was merciful, but the truth was he wanted the death to be perfect, poetic, symbolic. She died clean, but she died disgraced. Just 6 years later, it happened again. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, young, playful, barely 17, was accused of premarital affairs and infidelity during marriage. Once more, the trial became theatre. Her past lovers were hunted down, tortured, and made to describe their trysts in graphic detail. What she said, how she moved, what they did. The accusations weren't just legal arguments. They were public degradation. Her past was turned into scandal, her lovers into tools of humiliation. She too was executed, but before the blade, she was forced to walk past her former lover's decapitated head, spiked on a pike. Her death wasn't just about adultery. It was about erasing dignity, rewriting legacy, controlling a woman's body and name even after death. Henry didn't stop there. He used marriage itself as punishment. Daughters of nobles who angered him were often forced into marriages that mocked their bloodline. If a father opposed the king's decisions, or even hesitated, his daughter might find herself married to an elderly merchant, a crippled knight, or a man of questionable morals. And if the daughter resisted, she was stripped of her titles and sent away, sometimes to distant convents or poor estates, silenced with disgrace. One infamous example involved the widow of a rebel noble. Henry arranged her remarriage to a lowly court servant, a man known for his vulgarity and coarse manners. The ceremony was conducted under royal supervision. The bedding was witnessed by 2 guards to ensure consummation. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about alliance. It was punishment through humiliation. Even among the living, fear of shame replaced fear of death. Nobles whispered warnings to their sons and daughters. Do not attract the king's attention. Do not cross him. Do not love who he disapproves of. It's not your life he'll take. It's your name, your pride, your soul. And what made Henry's cruelty even more terrifying was the mask he wore. He smiled. He threw feasts. He praised God. He spoke of divine will and the sanctity of marriage, even as he used those very things to destroy lives. His court became a place of paranoia, where love was dangerous, beauty was a curse, and loyalty could be shattered by a single misstep in intimacy. When he died in 1547, bloated and broken, the kingdom didn't erupt in mourning. It sighed in relief, but the damage had been done, because Henry VIII had shown the world that a man didn't need swords or prisons to destroy you. He could simply marry you, love you, and then use your body and your history as a weapon, leaving behind not just corpses, but ghosts of dignity, wandering the corridors of English history, forever whispering the price of royal obsession. In the golden heart of medieval Baghdad, where libraries bloomed like gardens and scholars debated beneath moonlight, a darker force stirred behind the walls of the Caliph's palace. Al-Mustansir Billah, the 37th Abbasid Caliph, ruled from 1226 to 1242, a time when the Islamic world stood at the edge of invasion. But internally, it faced something just as chilling, punishment cloaked in divine justice, but designed for public shame. To the outside world, Al-Mustansir was pious, devout, a custodian of Sharia law. But what unfolded under his command turned morality into performance and religion into a scaffold of sexual humiliation. In Baghdad, sin didn't just mean you'd pay with your life. Under Al-Mustansir, you paid with your dignity first. Adultery, sodomy, fornication. These crimes were condemned by Islamic law, yes. But the way Al-Mustansir enforced them twisted the sacred into the grotesque. Before punishment came confession, but not quiet, penitent whispers. His courts demanded public confessions, delivered before massive crowds in the main mosque. Ibn al-Athar, a historian of the time, described one such event with chilling clarity. A man and woman, accused of adultery, were marched through Baghdad's most populated street, stripped down to the waist. Soldiers forced them to shout their sins in explicit detail when they met, what they did, how often, and even how it felt. The crowd listened in a stunned silence, not out of respect, but because they feared laughing. Crying, or even looking away, might be seen as sympathy. The fear was contagious. The shame became a plague. After their confessions, they weren't led to a quiet cell. They were paraded, publicly, slowly, through every major market, through every street near the mosques and madrasas, until they arrived at the execution ground. For hours, the condemned were forced to walk barefoot over scalding stone, bleeding, weeping, mocked by children and cursed by the devout. Then came the stoning, but the punishment wasn't always death. Sometimes, humiliation was the true sentence. One man, accused of sodomy, was not only condemned to die, he was first publicly castrated, then forced to wear a woman's veil and robe. and stand at the city gates for 2 full days while people spat, cursed, and threw filth at him. His manhood gone, his identity erased, his memory mutilated. Then, and only then, was he burned alive in the city's main square. This was not justice, this was domination, because Al-Mustansir knew what all tyrants eventually learned. A body can survive wounds, but a soul, shamed before its people, dies long before the flesh does. In one particularly cruel case, a noblewoman suspected of secret liaisons with a scholar was spared execution, but punished in a way that would haunt her bloodline. Her father was forced to witness her dragged through the city, her hair shaved, her face painted in ash, a board hung from her neck listing her lusts in crude writing. She was then forced into a convent not of peace but of exile. No contact, no name, forgotten even by her family. It was as if she had never lived. Al-Mustansir claimed that these punishments were for purification, for moral order, for Allah, but the scholars of the time, those brave enough to write in private, knew better. His methods were not about repentance, they were about control. They were warnings to the intellectuals. The merchants, the nobles, your sins, whether true or false, can be weaponized against you under his rule. Religion became theater. Public prayer was followed by public shame. The call to worship echoed alongside the call to stone. Men feared not just the whip, but what the whip would reveal. Who would be next? Who would be stripped? Who would lose not just their life, but their name, and in the end his reign, like the others, collapsed, not in battle, not in rebellion, but in silence. When the Mongols came in 1258, Baghdad fell with terrifying ease. Al-Mustansir had died long before, but the world he built, a world ruled by fear of exposure, left no loyalty strong enough to protect the city. Libraries burned, scholars were slaughtered, and the same public squares that once hosted confessions and stonings became graveyards. But the memories didn't burn, because shame doesn't die in fire. It passes on, in silence, in broken lineages, in names no longer spoken aloud, and so ends the story of the kings who ruled not just with swords, but with sex as punishment, with humiliation, with forced marriages, with public degradation. They understood a terrible truth, that to truly dominate a people you don't just kill them, you strip them, you shame them, you make their most sacred spaces, their bodies, their lovers, their children, tools of tyranny. And that kind of cruelty, it echoes longer than any empire ever could.